Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. All right. Hi, everyone. Just to be upfront, I'm testing a new format for myself, which is answering Q&A questions that people have had with me or things I've learned. And so I like to record them, except instead of speaking into an empty room, at least I'm speaking to myself in front of, 30 people. So we'll go from there. I think today's topic that I found really interesting over the past day was a lot of the conversations around Harvard, and obviously a lot of the conversation has been about the Harvard MBA as an education in terms of a consumption perspective. What I personally found interesting has been some of my thinking about how Harvard Business School runs as a business model in terms of what it means for education tech and the business model. And that's useful because I think it's contrarian to a lot of how people think about education. And I think it's useful because there's a lot of different learnings out there. And after my monologue, I'm sure that there'll be opportunity for people who are listening in to ask me questions about it. My goal is to eventually publish this, 2 months out on the website, but this is a way to do some live taping. So again, this is a beta to see what it is. I think the most interesting thing is that obviously everybody knows is that Harvard is very prestigious. But what's interesting is that the Harvard MBA program, the business school, has the most autonomy and freedom from the university's president and trustees. So what's interesting is that Harvard Business School is actually the most profitable of Harvard University program itself. And that's quite interesting because we already know that Harvard obviously has its school fees. It has one of the largest endowments in the world. Plus, obviously, its nonprofit status that lets it have its tax advantages. But what's also interesting is why the Harvard MBA program is such a money spinner, right? And I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. The flagship program, of course, is the MBA program, right? Where we all know that to attend the program is effectively $250,000 in terms of school fees and living expenses. As well as, not including the opportunity cost. What's interesting when we think about it is, of course, we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, that's really expensive. And of course, there are ways to lower the cost. I mean, they also have a very lavish student aid program that is very focused on helping people get access as long as they give you an offer. But I think what's, kind of counterintuitive is that, from the discussions I've heard with administrators is that Harvard Business School actually loses money on the MBA program, which is really fascinating, right? Because if we think about it, we're like, wow, there's $250,000 to attend Harvard for a 2-year MBA, but why is Harvard losing money on a per graduate level when you allocate direct costs and indirect costs? It kind of like is mind-boggling because it's so expensive one end, yet it's losing money, but yet it's somehow still making the most money and therefore has the most autonomy at the Harvard University level. And I think there's a couple of reasons when you dig deeper into it is that there's a lot to it, right? I think the first thing that we think about it is why do they choose to lose money on the MBA on a per graduate level? And the big part of it is that by spending very lavishly on the graduates of the MBA program, it helps keep the ratings high for the school itself, right? It's always number one and number two. Is known for good career education, is known for great professors, great student food, lifestyle, great, dorms and, accommodations, lavish student aid. All those things actually means that, Harvard actually chooses to lose money. But it, as a result, generates a couple of things that are really interesting, right? The first thing is that it generates very high ratings, which is important because that generates low acquisition costs in terms of referrals, But more importantly, it generates a stream of high referral candidates who go out into the workforce as referrers and testimonials, right? I mean, today we earlier had a panel on Clubhouse where Harvard MBAs and other MBA program graduates actually on their own volition acted as testimonials and as signals to the market for people to join potentially. And that's important because later on helps create a pipeline for the real moneymaker on one angle is the executive education program. And the executive education program, you call them, advanced management, EMP, GMP, and Harvard. There's lots of different versions of that. But executive education programs are for middle and later stage career executives who have met MBAs, are impressed by the MBAs out there, and who are testimonials, etc. And obviously, these executive education programs are obviously cheaper than a full-time 2-year MBA. But what's interesting for that is that even though it's cheaper, it's also much, much shorter than an MBA. In other words, the executive education program on a per day basis or per month basis or per week basis is significantly priced double, triple, quadruple that of an MBA program. And that's where they make the money, right? And a lot of these executive education programs are also not necessarily borne by the student, but also borne by the company, right? As a retention or as a corporate training tool. And so, it's interesting where the MBAs have chosen to be loss leaders on the MBA program to maintain number 1, number 2 program. But as a result, is able to make up on the profitability side on the executive education program. I think another way in terms of the revenue side as well, and that's very underappreciated about this, is that the Harvard MBAs are actually also used as a way to test trial a couple of key things. But one of them is actually the Harvard publishing arm. Obviously, we know that's the Harvard Business Review. Obviously at many different universities around the world, they use Harvard case studies as part of the materials. And that's actually an interesting set of products that the university sells as a way to generate a ton of value, right? Because, you're generating a case study on a company that was referred to you by a student or one of your alumni, and you use that to get an aperture into the business decision that needs to be made. And then you create the case study. And of course, there's a bit of a hump in terms of creating the content. Obviously it takes weeks, if not months to get it right and to and fro. But, honestly, it's not too much work. But more importantly, the marginal cost of distribution of the case is very low. And so you see Harvard, cases being used in local universities and other business schools. And so they're all using the publishing arm. And so these MBAs are often trialing the new cases, helping generate new cases. And so that actually generates a nice flywheel, again, where MBAs serve as signals and referrers of executive ads programs, but also helps bring in additional case studies, which are then resold to other business programs and other corporate training programs. And so that's already 2 major revenue streams that's there, right? I think another thing that MBA programs use is that they're also used to help train and screen junior professors at Harvard. And so obviously, we have in the second year of the program, there are obviously great world-class professors like Clayton Christensen and other thought leaders who very much are serving both the current program, but also the executive education program. But what's also interesting is that, the Harvard professors are very much being trained to not just be researchers, but also great facilitators and teachers in the classroom. And so they're being groomed into thought leaders and consultants who are, then screened and whether they make it into the executive education program. And there's a lot of money that's involved with that, all right? Obviously, we look at InnoSight, which was founded by Clayton Christensen, which is disruption theory. Obviously, Clayton Christensen has not only written multiple books, which again goes through the publishing arm, he also sells it as executive education classes who are there. It drives a ton of value in terms of short-term courses and the consulting arm. So there's this interesting flywheel where at the end of the day, we see that Harvard is generating the MBA program, which is loss leader, but making a lot of money on the publishing arm, as well as making a lot of money on the executive program and courses. And I think that actually creates some interesting learnings from an education tech angle, right? Obviously, if you're thinking about this from a consumer perspective about whether to do an MBA, this is more like understanding the incentives of the overall structure. But I think if you think about it from an education tech perspective, I think there's a couple of things that are interesting. I think one interesting thing, of course, is the concept of scarcity versus allocation. What that means is that we often think about education as very much like the more access that we can give out to people, the better. And I think that's how a lot of us who are in education are thinking about how do we allow more people to have access to education. But I think Harvard kind of like takes on the anti-marketing approach, right? Like how luxury marketing is the anti-marketing approach to most consumer goods, which is that scarcity creates value, right? So by restricting the number of seats, by becoming increasingly selective over time, it's able to create the halo effect. It's able to create brand value, but it's also able to create a tighter community inside, and which creates more value over time because these people actually value it. These people actually choose to access it and double down on the time effectively. They value the community and network over time because of the scarcity. And so it's interesting where, because the price is so high, to some extent, a little bit of a chicken egg circular argument here, but because people are allocating a big sacrifice of their time and money, they're also putting in much more commitment into an MBA program compared to all the other online education approaches, for example. And so there's this interesting piece where scarcity creates value. And I think Eric Thorenberg actually has an interesting approach where he's creating On Deck, and he writes that he wants to be the new Stanford, right? His claim is education institutions there has been no innovation over the past 100 years. And so he's looking to create the Stanford, but for like founding startups. And he's looking to recreate the multiple angles that are naturally bundled up in a university. So like community, obviously, content, access, scarcity, perceived value, networking, career support, outplacement. So he's looking to build all of that. I think he has some interesting writing about that as well. And I think he's actually building a very interesting flywheel. And I think he's got a good shot actually of making it happen. They're already spitting out cash. They're growing rapidly. And one of the things that I had a conversation with their teammates was, obviously, when they want to be the virtual Stanford, when they want to be a great center at the entrepreneurship level, it's interesting because they obviously started in Silicon Valley and they're able to build a great program from there. But I think my suspicion is that they're going to see the most growth from outside the US, right? Because inside the US, there's actually a lot of competition from, obviously, the universities are able to lower their prices over time to compete. But also because there's so much availability of good content, right? Virtual content. And, if you're in America, you can visit and still be in person. Great institutions. But I think companies like On Deck that are trying to become the Stanford or Harvard of founders online are really going to see a lot of growth in the blue ocean of markets that can't access Harvard or Stanford or even Berkeley or ASU or tier 3 university, right? And so I think there's going to be an interesting dynamic where they're going to see that growth on a very dramatic basis as well. So again, the first point was really about how it breaks a lot of concepts of educational tech and marketing. I think the second part that's interesting is obviously, we often look at education tech broken out as schools versus camps, right? And my friend liked to joke, he's a chief academic officer of a school chain, and then he's building a new set of schools. But he's like, hey, when you create a whole school, the barriers to entry are high. You need registration, etc. It's good at defending earnings and helps prevent copycats. But if you create camps, the opposite, right? Anybody can set up a camp. Anybody, it's and as a result, you can get some earnings in the short term, but it's hard to defend against. And I think he and I were having a to and fro about this, and we were saying, well, the different elementary schools and camps are kind of the same as Harvard Business School and the MBA program and executive education program. And so there's an interesting parallel where, we kind of look at them as a product as different, right? Schools versus camps. But if you look at the consumer, it's actually pretty similar, right? Which is it's parents who are looking to allow their children to learn at one level, to self-actualize at another level. And thirdly is to be safe, right? While the parents are away doing something else. And so I think that's kind of like the component where people can look at themselves like I'm in the school sector versus the camp sector. But actually, they're kind of in the same business as in terms of if you actually really drill down to it, real customer are parents, right? Because the parents are the one making decisions, purchasing decisions and budget decisions and choice decisions about their children's choice of time. And obviously, there's a classic bifurcation of users versus customers, right? The parents are customers paying, but the users are the kids. So, and what's interesting about that is then you move away from thinking about camps versus schools and start saying something like, well, this is actually an LTV dynamic, a lifetime value. If we are selling a school to someone in terms of education, we should also be selling the camps, right? We should also be selling the other activities, the extracurriculars, the weekend activities, because we know who the parents are, we know who the kids are, we know their requirements. And so we shouldn't try to package ourselves as a single product or single methodology of approach, but actually look at it as a flywheel where success in the initial wedge called the school or the camp helps create the data and the preferences data to help spin off the next product. And so there's an interesting component where, I think a lot of great schools are able to monetize the whole spectrum of that. So that's the interesting piece of how the Harvard Business School approach is applicable to other education tech approaches, I think. I think the third thing that is very interesting is that the Harvard School program is an interesting choice because they're fighting against all of the online school programs out there, right? And actually, there was a big debate, I think, between Clayton Christensen and Michael Porter. So one handled disruption, another person handled Porter's 5 forces. And they had a big debate about whether Harvard should even do online at all. And, the answer was the school did both, right? It kept its offline piece, but also has been doing the HBX online program, where we see a lot of people actually taking on programs online. I think the jury's still a little bit out because if you think about it from a distribution play, then the short answer is that Harvard will definitely be disrupted over time and unbundled and attacked from multiple angles from all the different courses and different technology out there. So if you think about it as if Harvard is an educational institution, then it's going to get unbundled, it's going to get disrupted, and it's going to get overtaken by all the people trying to take a slice of it. However, if you think about it from a luxury marketing angle, then it's very different because you can't disrupt luxury. I think it doesn't follow the same rules, right? And so there's an interesting dynamic, I think, that Harvard Business School is still sorting out, which is, are we a luxury product where the ability to purchase us and access us either as an MBA or an executive ad, or to be participating as a professor or stakeholder is a luxury signal, because that's not going to get disrupted anytime soon. And in fact, the more disruption and the more commoditized the rest of the market becomes, the more powerful the luxury signal will become of its scarcity and its old schoolness, traditionalness, right? It's hard to disrupt Chanel or LVMH, or some of the whiskey that's out there, because the more entrants there are, the better the signal becomes. But I think if you look at Harvard Business School as a place of education, then the distribution of it will get disrupted over time. So anyway, those would be my 3 thoughts in terms of doing a deep dive into Harvard Business School, not as an education program, but actually as a business model. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say. And it's my first experiment ever on saying something. And if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask me any questions about what I just asked about, feel free to raise your hand.
Hey, Jeremy. Quick intro about myself. I'm Stanley.
Yep.
Currently a gap year student at Duke University. I'm Indonesian. I'm part of Duke's class of 2024. So I just want to ask you if you knew about Harvard's or HBS's 2+2 program, where it's kind of like a deferred MBA program where you apply in your senior year of college, and then you get in, and then you spend 2 years, working or whatever, and then you come back to HBS. So I was just wondering, if you knew about that and what you think of that, as compared to, the usual application cycle.
Yeah, happy to share. You're talking about this from a consumer angle, from a business angle?
I guess from a consumer angle, yeah.
Yeah, so I think from a consumer angle, I was under the 2+2 program. So I applied in UC Berkeley after doing my MBA internship and was able to get an offer. And I went to Bain. And then after that, I built a social enterprise consulting platform, bootstrapped that to profitability, and then headed off to do my Harvard MBA after deferring 1 year to make it successful. I think, if you can do it, why not do it? I think someone was sharing earlier that if you can take 2 shots at a target, why not, right? So if there's not much opportunity cost to applying for it and see if you get in or not, right? And so you get a second shot, you get more optionality. So there's no real downside, except for the fact that you're doing a GMAT, but your GMAT is retained for 5 years, right? So it's not much of a downside. Application fee is negligible. So, I don't think there's any harm in applying, and there's an upside if it's relevant for your future skill. I think what's interesting, again, because today I've been talking more from the business angle, is that I think the 2+2 program is also used to basically look for talent that normally would not take Harvard MBA. So obviously Harvard has an interest in making a geographically diverse and industry diverse approach. They're looking really like a portfolio, you could call it, or you could look at it as an orchestra, but they're really focused to make sure that there's enough diversity to make it a valuable experience for everybody. So this is their way to basically target, who they believe is underrepresented, right? So that would be, for example, engineering, but also geography as well, right? So Southeast Asia is massively underrepresented in Harvard MBA program, as well as obviously to target like gender and other, diversity requirements that they have, right? So I remember in my class of 90 people at Harvard, we were obviously doing a ton of American cases, and but I remember that obviously I think the first macroeconomics case study was actually in Singapore, because Singapore is an easy country to study for macroeconomics because it's so small and not too complicated a story. But I think they asked me, the question was like asking about Singapore's like interactions between its political choices versus economic choices, right? Versus social choices. And I think I remember being on the spot there, and obviously there was a big contrast between Singapore versus America, ideals around political, social freedoms versus economic freedoms. But I think what was interesting was that the awkward feeling was that there wasn't any other Southeast Asian folk in the room, in the 90 people. And that was actually true for multiple cases. So, we were talking about Vietnam, we're talking about Cambodia, and out of the 90 people, I was the only person from Southeast Asia, right? The only other person was a Bulgarian lady who had worked for a few years in Bali at a startup. And so she was the only other person who had some exposure to Southeast Asia. Obviously, there were people from China, there were people from, Japan, there were people from Korea. But in my class of 90 people, I represent me, and the Bulgarian startup lady represented Southeast Asia. And so people will be like, "Oh, what do you think about Vietnam?" And I'm like, wow, like, I don't want to talk about Vietnam or Indonesia because, I'm very conscious that I'm not an Indonesian citizen, right? Or a Cambodian citizen. These are very difficult topics, right? Or speaking about the Myanmar issues. But I think in the class of 90 people where we had a Socratic method, I was the only Southeast Asian in the room to provide a neighborly point of view, I guess, on Southeast Asian topics. And so I think that's something that's a big important part about the Harvard MBA from a consumer and from a business angle. Yes, Danny, go ahead.
Of course. Just very lastly, I think that's a great answer, Jeremy. Is it okay if I shoot you a message over LinkedIn to talk about a little bit more about how to apply to 2+2, what to prepare and whatnot, because it's definitely something I'm thinking about doing.
Yeah, feel free to, add me on LinkedIn. If you go to jeremyout.com, I do have other episodes interviewing other Harvard folks and talking about the Harvard application process as well. So there's a podcast set of episodes there. And then I'm personally not doing too many one-on-one chats because there's too many, but using to hopefully record those answers here in this conversation so that I can record as a podcast and then reshare it with other folks. Yeah. So Stanley, why don't you hold on to your question right now, and then let me just cycle through Jeremiah and Buvano, all right?
Hi, Jeremy. Been a long time since I've been in the same room as you, ironically. So I just have two short questions. So first of all, I may have missed it, but you mentioned about having this kind of concept that parents are the consumers, whereas the students are the users. But from the viewpoint of an MBA degree, I mean, I think that concept is applicable when we're talking about bachelor degrees. I don't know whether I missed it, but when we're talking about MBAs, is it safe to say that actually when we come with MBAs, it's actually the student is both the consumer and the user in this case? I don't know whether I missed it. I just wanted to clarify. And second of all, I really like your insight on how luxury brands, when the industry is being disrupted and being decoupled. I think that's the word that I forgot the word that you used, but when the offerings become decoupled, actually luxury brands' value actually increase. Is the converse also true, which is when educational offerings, or any industry, doesn't have to be education, but when educational offerings are debundled, actually brands that are not luxurious, maybe like tier 3, tier 4 universities, actually they become more devalued? And is this a general concept, not just in education? Do you think, I'm just trying to draw the generalization here, is it something that is true specifically in the education field, and is it something that is generalizable outside of education as well? So that's just kind of like my two questions. How it makes sense, Jeremy? Sorry.
No, this actually those are really good questions. Okay, great. You've energized me. This is my first time ever doing this format, and so I'm really excited because I started this format because I wanted to see whether a monologue with some quick thoughts would be helpful. But yes, I think this Q&A is really helpful. I think you asked two really good questions there. I think the first question you asked was the difference between customers and users, right? And I think you're spot on. So I think when you talk about when early education, elementary school, middle school, high school, even universities, a huge extent, a lot of it is actually not decided by the child in many ways, right? Because the parents are a big decision maker about whether they can afford to send a kid to education, etc. Obviously, and I think where you're right to say is, obviously at some point it becomes more of a normal choice, right? Where the two roles go back into it together, right? So I think, and there's some truth to that. So for example, one way to look at it is if you look at American university students, because of the student loan program, because of financial aid, it's actually been cohered together again, right? Because children get to choose which university to go to as long as they're willing to take out the student loans, right? That's often the biggest financial decision they have made at that point of time, right? Whether to, take on hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt. And of course, conversely, obviously, we look at private education, even university level, a lot of it is highly subsidized by the government in many parts of the world. So again, that's roughly around a time frame when people are making their own decision. But yeah, I think when you look at adult education, lots of people are using YouTube, right? Recently I was learning how to assemble something, and I went to YouTube and I learned how to assemble something, right? So I'm the user and the consumer. I obviously paid using my own eyeball, and I watched some ad on home improvement ads along the way. So I think MBA is also kind of interesting where, it's kind of true. Obviously, that a lot of them are paying out of pocket. So I think it's, again, mostly together. Obviously, anything on Skillshare is mostly people paying for themselves. So I think there's a great insight there. Yes, it does cohere together again, especially in adult education. I think that also, from my angle, I think that's what kind of makes it a little bit interesting is that category is much more amenable for consumerization, because then, you have all these people, obviously going to incubators or paying money to join on deck $5,000, right, to be part of that training course. And the consumerization of that is very appealing for that because they have the high. When you see great value, they will refer that to other people. It's just like any other product, and so there's a lot of viral mechanics that can happen. Whereas if you provide a world-class elementary school education and your kid is mind blown, and obviously the parents understand that and are happy about their kid, but then they can't. It's not a natural organic referral piece, right? The kids can't sell the school to other kids to choose, right? Does it make sense? And so the kids have to sell their parents, who sell other parents to send their kids, right? So there's a little bit more of a different approach there. So that's my first answer to this first thing. The second thing that you asked was actually a really interesting part, and thanks for making me go deeper in this conversation. I think as educational institutions or any kind of product gets disrupted and you see a flood of cheaper and cheaper versions of it, luxury as a signal, as an anti-marketing rule, actually increases the value to the people doing it, as well as increases its perceived value upon using it, and it also increases the enjoyment of it while consuming it. And I think you're exactly right to say that. I think we're starting to see that in educational institutions, especially at the MBA program. I think we're seeing that your middle tier schools are getting really, really horribly attacked by all these online courses or online MBAs or alternatives. Because if you can go to Harvard, Stanford, or, to some extent, I think NCI is definitely in top tier, but to some extent, if you look at the application rates for the second tier, third tier, so you're looking at like Kellogg or other universities that are kind of like one tier down, is not a clear luxury signal, then I think you see people kind of going themselves, well, why am I paying $100,000 of school fees when I can just assemble that with 50 courses, right? They could reassemble the whole thing. I mean, there's so much free content out there. I was recently listening to a course by Jordan Peterson, and obviously he's very controversial in terms of some of the movement around it. But I was listening to his psychology course, and I was finding that his academic course was actually very fascinating, right? Because it's about hero's journey, etc. And he was literally filmed his whole university course. So I didn't need to go to his university to go for that course, right? And he's like the star of the school, I guess, in that domain, right? In psychology. So actually there's some interesting dynamics here a little bit, where it's some similarity. The schools are kind of like this weird, like equivalent to content platforms like New York Times, or, they have a stable of professors, right? Stable teachers, and you have great teachers on one hand, and then you have in the middle, you have average teachers, and at the bottom, you have like teachers who are getting trained, right? And I think great institutions will figure out economics that are very much focused on training and having that long-term angle on their stars in their portfolio, the best professors. So Harvard Business School has Porter's 5 Forces. So everybody knows him because everyone in business school, business slides use him. But also Caitlin Christensen, which is the entire technology world knows about disruption, right? So these are the star writers, and they manage as they're using Harvard as an agent. But I think when you look at your tier 2, tier 3, and I think the similar sort to New York Times is doing really well, right? Because it's no longer just a New York newspaper; it's a global newspaper for everybody around the world. And because of those economics and the subscription, they're able to hold the world's best talent. And it still has the brand, and it's a luxury piece of news, right? But if you look at everybody else in the middle, I think there's a bit of a barbell distribution going on where your middle folks are getting disrupted or unbundled. And so anybody who's any good in these like tier 2 and tier 3 institutions might as well go to YouTube and start their own course, right? Or might as well go to Substack and become a great writer, or might as well become a consultant on their own, because it's, run a great podcast, right? And I think we saw that Jordan Peterson, he left the institution effectively and set up his YouTube was so successful, and he wrote a ton of books, and he became effectively independent from the school as well. So I think there's this interesting dynamic here where I think your tier 2, tier 3 institutions are going to struggle because they're getting unbundled by everybody else and they don't have luxury angle.
Yeah, I hope there are more studies on this whole concept. I think you introduced an excellent concept, and I hope the audience really takes note of this. But I do hope that there's a very formal study on this tier 2, tier 3 thing. By the way, thanks a lot for the time, Jeremy. I really enjoyed this room and this new method that you're trying out. Thanks, Jeremy. See you around.
Yep. Thanks, Jeremiah. Bhuvan, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Jeremy, once again. I already had a question with you earlier today. So my question is more around HPS 2+2. So basically around building a good application for HPS 2+2. So my current profile is basically around software engineering, and I'm a junior undergraduate student, and my university is also one of the top schools from India. So I'm keen to know what could be a potentially a good addition to this profile before I go about applying HPS 2+2. Yeah. So basically, my profile is mostly around software engineering till now, but I want to apply for HPS 2+2. So what things can I probably add to make it a better application?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best place to go is a source called Poets and Quants. It's a magazine, online journal on MBA, and I think they have a section called like Rate My Odds or Rate My Chances. And so every week, I think people submit their background, and they get rated basically by admission consultants on their chances of getting into various schools. So the truth is that, Bhuvan, I think you think you're a very special person. And I also think you're a unique person. But obviously, from the perspective of Harvard, they see thousands of your application every year, right? And they probably see millions of it over the course of, multiple years. So I think from their perspective, a big conversation that always has to happen is does the archetype that Bhuvan represents, is he the best of that archetype? And that's really important to think about, because that sometimes moves the conversation away from, are you just, what makes you different from everybody else, to are you the best version of the archetype, right? The truth is, for myself, and of course, 2+2, I wrote the application, I wrote my story. I was in, I think there's a great book, I can't remember what it's called, like Secrets of MBA Admissions. I'll put it up as a, on jeremyhour.com. I'll put it in we have a discussion board, and I'll put together a list of all the resources. So sign up, register there, and I'll share the link of the book. But I thought that was an eye-opening piece where the admission board as a group was basically saying like, yeah, this person is a management consultant. And so we know all the weaknesses of a management consultant, right? Which is, yes, they are good at speaking, they're analytical, they're good at numbers, but what do they want to do in their life that's really going to change the world, right? There's basically like, they were like looking at and bucketing all these people into various archetypes, and then trying to make sure that, they would have a certain number of slots for, nonprofit leaders, for example. And then for them, the part they would want to make sure is like, does this person have a good enough GMAT on the math section? Because can they do numbers, right? Can they be quantitative and keep up with the homework? So from that perspective, if you were a nonprofit leader and you're a great nonprofit leader, but you didn't have the hygiene factor of being decent at math, then you're just not going to get in either. So I think, Bhuvan, at the end of the day, it's just like, look, you're an IIT grad. There's a ton of IIT grads applying to Harvard, right? And so the question is, I assume the archetype for engineers would be, and I think it goes back to articles they write, is you're a great engineer, great. Are you a top engineer from the angle? So you need to cover that base. And the second base is, do you pass the hygiene factors of being social, right? And being able to speak and communicate properly. English fluency because you're from India. What kind of like big goals that you have, management and executive program wise, or do you want to go back to being an engineer? Kind of dynamic. So again, I think the book that I would recommend is on the discussion board, and it will cover pretty much, you probably fit the engineer persona as well as the international candidate persona.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Can you just tell me about what's the place where the book you mentioned is?
Yeah, go to jeremyhour.com, and if you sign up for the message board, then there'll be a post with all the resources. Yeah. Does anybody have any more questions? I know I spent a lot of time. It's interesting where I done some analysis on Harvard MBA as a school program, but also getting two sets of questions, one about the business model and one about the application process. Rina.
Hey, Jeremy. So I just joined the room, so I'm sorry if someone already asked the same question. But my question is, how did you value the going to the MBA? Because some people think that going to the MBA is kind of the waste of the time and their money. So instead of going to the MBA, like just do your own business, and then that's more like the value of going to the MBA. So I would like to hear your opinion that, like, how do you, what kind of people should go to the MBA, or how do you, what kind of the experiences that you get from the, especially HBS.
Great. And Rina, I see that you're from Duke. Are you an undergrad? Were you an undergrad there?
Oh, so no, I grew up in Japan, but I went to the Fuker, but that was not like, that was more like the 1-year business program intended for the younger professionals. So it was called the Master Management program, but it's a bit similar to the MBA, but it wasn't the same exactly with the MBA.
Great. I think there are, three types of folks that would benefit from going for Harvard MBA. I think the first is if you are trying to go, and I think this is the most utilitarian way to look at it, is people who want to go for a certain career, right? If you know you want to be a management consultant or iBanker or private equity, a bunch of, you want to get promoted in your company for certain functions. It's often very common to have MBA, right? And so it's an understood requirement, cultural and symbolic, and a signal to go for it. And obviously, McKinsey being BCG, there's a ton of partners who all have, Harvard or, Stanford MBAs or INSEAD MBAs. So I think there's the first group is I think people who understand what the clarity is about what they need to do to climb and, and get into certain roles. I think the second, obviously, for MBA program, and this is a little bit more broader than just the Harvard side, is, I think there's a tremendous number of people who use it to, change careers, right? Either in terms of location or industry, right? And it's a nice way to cleanse the palate a little bit. So, I obviously know one friend who was in India and he was working more on, route management for an airline in Asia. And basically because of the Harvard MBA program, he was able to transition into doing more of a, still relatively quantitative role at Fitbit, which was a technology company, obviously doing that out of San Francisco. So basically he managed to do like a double jump, well, effectively a triple jump, I guess, because he changed his role as well. So he changed his role, he changed his industry, from the flight industry to technology, and then thirdly, obviously, he changed location from India to SF, right? Because of the visa and as well as the employer openness to hiring from these Harvard MBA pool. What's also interesting is that he actually turned out to hate that job, and then he would transition to become a McKinsey consultant. So anyway, similar to maybe bucket one, but true long way around, right? But I think very few people could have changed industries and locations and roles at the same time if not for the Harvard MBA. Because, if you were in Singapore and you said you want to move to America, like a lot of companies would be like, whoa, why would we hire you from Singapore? The second part is like, whoa, you're in Singapore now and we're a Singaporean company, but we're in technology and you're in F&B, right? It's a much more difficult explanation as well. And then thirdly, of course, changing role, right? And I was like, hey, we're in the strategic planning team and now you're coming from the finance department. I think there's a bit of conversation there as well. So I think there's some retooling possible on the personal side around industry, geography, and role. And I think the third group of people that should explore the Harvard MBA, I think there's more a broader piece, but I think if they're aware and clear that they want to build a career in business and in a leadership role, and this is very fuzzy, because the truth is there's lots of great programs. I mean, while I was on a Harvard campus, I was hanging out with other people in my social circle from Southeast Asia. And a lot of people are doing Harvard Kennedy School, right? Because they knew that in the future they wanted to be a public servant or they wanted to be a politician or a government leader in the future. So they knew that taking a Harvard Kennedy School Masters of Public Policy was a way better fit for them, both in interests and academics and network. And the truth is Harvard Kennedy School was like chock full of, it was crazy. I would hang out with them and there would be like, the sons of presidents and prime ministers and daughters, right? From very rich families that were just like aware that they wanted to be in that domain, right? Social political domain, right? And I also would hang out with other people who grew from nothing and were like activists, or also were hungry to climb, the political ladder, right? So that was a very interesting dynamic where you could have gone and said, I wanted to be at Harvard Kennedy School, or I wanted to be at Harvard Business School, right? And both of them would be very useful tools to get you to where they want to be. But Harvard Business School would be an order of magnitude less helpful to help you if you want to be a public servant. And I had other friends who were like at Harvard Divinity School, right? And they were training to be a chaplain, right? Which was a great place, there's a theology and interdisciplinary point of view as well, interfaith work. So there's this interesting dynamic where, if you know that you want to be a leader in the business world, then I think that helps a lot as well. But that third one is the most fuzzy, I would say, in terms of approach. And I think there's there are many good ways to spend $250,000 effectively. So I don't think you need to take an MBA to succeed in business. Is just one of the routes to do so.
Thank you. And also, how was your like a business school experiences help to like start your own business? Or sorry, did you start your like business before you went to the HBS, or like you studied after graduated from the Harvard?
Yeah, that's a great question. Long story short is I went to Harvard knowing that. So, chronologically, I had gone to undergrad and I had wanted to be in high school, I wanted to be a vaccine scientist and a poet on the side. And then I've shared this on my podcast before, but I suffered a personal loss and I pretty much crashed out of school, and I went to the army. And then after there, I kind of like woke up from the grief and then figured out that I needed to get back on the academics train. And so I managed to claw my way into UC Berkeley. And there in the initial days, I wanted to be actually working on vaccine strategy as a consultant after some serendipitous activities involving the social impact consulting. But again, there. And then it turned out that Bridgespan Group, which is the top nonprofit consulting group in America and globally, I'll say, as well as the Gates Foundation, which we all know obviously today, but both of them didn't really accept international students and applicants. And so I ended up doing my third choice, which was going to Bain as a corporate consultant, right? So, and as a corporate consultant, I kind of realized that I loved the problem solving and the problems that are there and the rigor. And actually, I really loved the high achiever culture where everybody was like very hungry to learn, hungry for professional development. But I didn't really like, I think it was just there's no sense of mission. That was very important for me. And also I didn't like some of the dynamics around like travel and so forth. So, and I was on the side building out this social enterprise, which became very successful. And I realized I enjoyed the founder aspect of that role, right? And so I ended up building and focusing on that thing. I enjoyed the building from, product market fit from 0 to 1, but also 1 to 10, making it profitable and, eventually finding my successor. So I like that part, but I realized that I didn't really like the pure social sectorness of it. I didn't feel like the impact could scale very clearly. The economics of how that would scale and be sustainable was also a bit difficult. And so I went to Harvard Business School thinking to myself, I said, okay, I'm going to come in. And I shared this on the JeremyAu.com podcast in a different episode. I came in, I said, I had 3 rules for myself based on feedback I heard was, the first one was, I'm going to meet a new person every day. So it was an opportunity to meet lots of people. And so I said, I want to meet a new person every day. So I would just wake up in the morning and then hang out and meet new people along the way. And if I ended up not meeting someone yet, I would just introduce myself to someone and just say hi and have some great conversations along the way, because everybody who goes to an MBA program is paying $250,000 is also wanting to meet people as well. So it's a matter of, who's on the dance floor first to ask questions. So that was there. The second thing that I said that I wanted to do was that I felt like I was a strong founder, but I wanted to learn what it meant to be a CEO, right? And so obviously I had been a consultant supporting CEOs and making tough decisions in terms of analysis, helping them write emails and things like that. I had also been a founder in building product market fit, but I felt like there was something in between the scaling aspect, the 1 to 10, the 10 to 100 aspect that I really wanted to take the time to learn. And so I spent a lot of my courses really learning about not just the product market fit piece, but focusing very deeply on like the core decisions you need to make as the founder transitions to becoming the CEO. And just like yesterday, I was helping a friend, and he's part of a 10-person company, and he's at an interesting inflection point now where it's not just a founder, it's not just a small team, but it's actually becoming a real rigorous company, and they have to change and let go of some of the decisions they've made in order to pursue the new chapter of growth, right? And of course, I think the third thing I said to myself was that I wanted to either join something that I really cared about or to build something if I couldn't find it. And so I was actually in the first year, actually part of the healthcare club, because for me, I was kind of exploring that angle where I was like, okay, I want something that does have the rigorous decision making, but I also want that clear social good aspect of it. And so I was thinking that maybe hospital administration, I was taking a lot of classes and to understand that as a way to tie together what I learned about myself. And so I ended up building and testing different iterations, actually, of mental health care clinics in Southeast Asia with a mix of online and offline, both, or just digital only. Then ended up looking at exploring mental health in the States. Then, zooming into like postpartum depression, because there's a very identifiable clinical population within that. And then zooming in further, finding out that there are many reasons why people had postpartum depression, but the biggest one in the States was actually the lack of childcare and the inability to go to work because they couldn't find great childcare for their infants. And so that was the birth of the first company pretty much in the summer. And so I had been sponsored at the time for my school. I had a stipend to be a social enterprise summer fellow of the Rock Center for Entrepreneurship. And that's how I got started. That was after that summer was. So again, my first year, I was exploring different ideas, but also exploring different job fairs, exploring different startups. Then the summer was when I was doing a lot of testing and ended up landing on an idea that I cared about, which was early education, using a sharing economy approach. And then after that, from there, in the second year, I actually started building the company, raising funds, hiring employees. So it was an interesting time period where in my second year of Harvard MBA, I was like managing, 1 or 2 employees, right? While I was taking classes. And so I had to skip a lot of some stuff basically just to manage the teammates in the incubator. And then, this is new, but, the truth is I hit the academic screen where basically I didn't do so well for those grades in terms of like attendance because I was busy building a company. And so I had to do an additional semester at Harvard to do MBA. But it was a great experience, and then learned a lot from that experience. So yeah, I ended up building the company while I was there. And then basically when I raised the seed round upon graduation, pretty much from Next View Ventures, and then it was after the races from there, building the company from Boston and expanding to New York over the next few years.
Okay, thank you so much.
And feel free if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise their hands, and I'm happy to bring you up and answer any questions that you may have as well. I think one interesting thing that came up with it, in terms of like educational skills, was like, obviously, I think there's a lot of information I learned about the founders-CEO role. So obviously, I got a chance to practice building term sheets, valuation models, liquidity waterfalls. So a bunch of stuff that honestly you can get on the internet these days. It's not too hard to learn. I think the second thing I learned was obviously a very strong community of other startup founders from the Harvard MBA ecosystem. So that was interesting to build out and learn from as well. And we're still good friends from today. I was just recently helping one with his transition, helping another person with his seed deck. And so it's a very interesting piece where Harvard is actually a very entrepreneurial ecosystem. And of course, the third thing that was helpful from the Harvard MBA perspective was that it's a good signal, right? It's still a signal to talent, an expensive one for sure, but it's a signal, and that's helpful in terms of opening up conversations with venture capitalists and other stakeholders. Obviously, I want to kind of put a big fat caveat there, which is that there are many other better signals to start up, like, for example, building a successful startup already and exiting it in the same space, or building or being part of a high growth startup or company in the same space. So there's lots of different ways to have signals. But Harvard MBA is a signal in its own right. Awesome. That's pretty much 1 hour. So interesting timing and learning about this podcast approach. And I'll try this again tomorrow, and then I'll do another topic that might be interesting. So tune in at the same time for tomorrow. All right. See y'all. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.